Chapter 7 of Lady Jane Grey and Her Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Lady Jane Grey and Her Times by Ida Ashworth Taylor. Chapter 7, 1547 to 1548. Catherine Parr's unhappy married life, dissensions between the Seymour brothers, the king and his uncles, the Admiral and Princess Elizabeth, birth of Catherine's child, and her death. The belated idyll of love and happiness enjoyed by Caterine the Queen was of pitifully short duration. During the first days of September 1548, some 15 months after the stolen marriage at Chelsea, a funeral procession left Sudley Castle, and the body of the wife of the Lord Admiral was carried forth to burial. Lady Jane Grey, his ward, then in her 12th year, acted as chief mourner. Jane had good cause to mourn in other than an official capacity. It is hard to believe that, had Catherine Parr been living, the child she had cared for and who had made her home under her roof would not have been saved from the doom destined to overtake her not 6 years later. Catherine's dream had died before she did, and the period of her marriage, short though it was, must have been a time of rapid disillusionment. It could scarcely, taking the circumstances into account, have been otherwise. Seymour was not the man to make the happiness of a wife, touching upon middle age, studious, learned, and devout, avoiding all occasions of idleness, and contemning vain pastimes. His love, if indeed it had been ever other than disguised ambition, was short-lived, and Catherine's awakening must have come all too swiftly. Nor was the revelation of her husband's true character her only cause of trouble. Minor vexations had, from the first, attended her new condition of life, and she had been made to feel that the wife of the Protector's younger brother could not expect to enjoy the deference due to a dowager queen. To Catherine, who clung to her former dignity, the loss of it was no light matter, and her sister-in-law, the Duchess of Somerset, and she were at open war. Contemporary and early writers are agreed as to the nature of the woman with whom she had to deal. The Protector, explains the Spanish chronicler, giving the popular version of the affair, had a wife who was prouder than he was, and she ruled the Protector so completely that he did whatever she wished, and she, finding herself in such great state, became more presumptuous than Lucifer. Hayward attributes the subsequent disunion between the brothers, in the first place, to the unquiet vanity of a mannish, or rather a devilish woman, for many imperfections intolerable, but for pride monstrous; whilst Henlin represents the Duchess as observing that, if Mr. Admiral should teach his wife no better manners, I am she that will. The struggle for precedence carried on between the wives could scarcely fail to have a bad effect upon the relationship of the husbands, already at issue upon graver questions, and Warwick, Somerset's future rival, was at hand to foment the strife between Protector and Admiral, and, secretly playing with both hands, paved the way for the fall of the younger brother and the consequent weakening of the forces which barred the way to the attainment of his personal ambitions. Nor can there be any doubt that, apart from the ill offices of those who desired to separate the interests of the brothers, the Protector had good reason to stand upon his guard. When Seymour was tried for his life during the winter of 1548-9, dependents and equals alike came forward to bear witness to his intriguing propensities, their evidence going far to prove that whatever may be thought of Somerset's conduct as a brother in sending him to the scaffold, as head of the state and responsible for the government of the realm, he was not without justification. It is clear that from the first the Admiral, jealous of the position accorded to the Duke by the Council, had been sedulously engaged in attempting to undermine his power, and had not disguised his resentment at his appropriation of undivided authority. Never had it been seen in a minority, so he informed a confidant, that the one brother should bear all rule, the other none. One being protector, the other should have filled the post of governor to the king, so he averred, although on another occasion, contradicting himself, he declared he would wish the earth to open and swallow him rather than accept either post. There was abundant proof that he had done his utmost, whenever opportunity was afforded him, to rouse the king to discontent. It was a disagreeable feature of the day that men were in no wise slack in accusing their friends in times of disgrace, thereby seeking to safeguard their reputations. And Dorset came forward later to testify that Seymour had told him that his nephew had divers times made his moan, saying that "my uncle of Somerset dealeth very hardly with me, and keepeth me so strait that I cannot have money at my will." The Lord Admiral, added the boy, both sent him money and gave it to him. Perhaps the most significant testimony brought against the Admiral was that of the little king himself, who asserted that Seymour had charged him with being bashful in his own affairs, asking why he did not speak to bear rule as did other kings. "I said I needed not, for I was well enough," the boy replied on this occasion. At another time, according to his confession, a conversation took place, the more grim from the simplicity of the language in which it is recorded. "Within these 2 years at least," said Edward, now 11 years old, he said, "ye must take upon yourself to rule, and then ye may give your men somewhat, for your uncle is old, and I trust he will not live long." I answered it were better that he should die. It was scarcely possible that the Protector should not have been cognizant of a part at least of his brother's machinations, and he naturally, so far as was possible, kept his charge from falling further under the influence of his enemies. The young king's affection for his stepmother had been a cause of disquiet to her brother-in-law and his wife, care being taken to separate him from her as much as was possible. So long as Catherine remained in London, it had been Edward's habit to visit her apartments unattended, and by a private entrance. Familiar intercourse of this kind terminated when she removed to a distance, and, so far as the Lord Protector could ensure obedience, little communication was permitted between the two during the short time the Queen had to live. The boy, however, was constant to old affection, and used what opportunities he could to express it. "If his Grace could get any spare time," wrote one John Fowler, a servant of the royal household, to the Admiral, "his Grace would write a letter to the Queen's Grace and to you. His Highness desires your Lordship to pardon him, for his Grace is not half a quarter of an hour alone. But in such leisure as his Grace has, his Majesty hath written, here enclosed, his commendations to the Queen's Grace and to your Lordship, that he is so much bound to you that he must remember you always, and, as his Grace may have time, you shall well perceive by such small lines of recommendations with his own hand." The scribbled notes, on scraps of paper, written by stealth and as he could find opportunity by the King, testify to the closeness of the watch kept upon him. Their contents show the means by which the Admiral strove to maintain his hold upon his nephew. "My lord," so runs the first, "send me, per Latimer, as much as ye think good, and deliver it to Fowler." The second note is one of thanks. An attempt was made by the Admiral to obtain a letter from the king which, complaining of the Protector's system of restraint, should be laid before Parliament. But the intrigue was discovered, the Admiral summoned to appear before the Council, and though he was at first inclined to bluster, and replied by a defiance, a hint of imprisonment brought him to reason, and some sort of hollow reconciliation between the brothers followed. The king, the unfortunate subject of dispute, was probably lonely enough. For his tutor, Sir John Cheke, and for his schoolmate, Barnaby Fitzpatrick, he appears to have entertained a real affection. But for his elder uncle and guardian he had little liking, nor was the Duchess of Somerset a woman to win the heart of her husband's ward. From his stepmother and the Admiral he was practically cut off, and his sisters, for whom his attachment was genuine, were at a distance and paid only occasional visits to court. Mary's influence, as a Catholic, would naturally have been feared, and Elizabeth, living for the time under the Admiral's roof, would be regarded likewise with suspicion. But the happiness of the nominal head of the state was not a principal consideration with those around him, mostly engaged in a struggle not only to secure present personal advantages, but to ensure their continuance at such time as Edward should have attained his majority. The relations between the Seymour brothers being that of a scarcely disguised hostility, the Admiral had the more reason to congratulate himself upon having obtained the possession and disposal of the person of Lady Jane Grey, third, save for her mother, in the line of succession to the throne. Should her guardian succeed in effecting her marriage with the king, the arrangement might prove of vital importance. On the other hand, Somerset's matrimonial schemes for the younger members of the royal house were of an altogether different nature. He would have liked to marry the king to a daughter of his own, another Lady Jane, and to have obtained the hand of Lady Jane Grey for his son, young Lord Hertford. Such projects, however, belonged to the future. Nothing could be done for the present, nor does it appear that, when Somerset's scheme afterwards became known to the king, it met with any favour in his eyes, since, noting it in his journal, he added his private intention of wedding a foreign princess, well stuffed and jewelled. So far as Catherine was concerned, her domestic affairs were probably causing her too much anxiety to leave attention to spare for those of king or kingdom, except as they were gratifying, or the reverse, to her husband. Since the May day when she had given herself, rashly and eagerly, into the keeping of the Lord Admiral, she had been sorrowfully enlightened as to the nature of the man and of his affection, and if she still loved him, her heart must often have been heavy. The presence of the Princess Elizabeth under her roof had been disastrous in its consequences, and though it was at first the interest of all to keep the matter secret, the inquisition made at the time of the Admiral's disgrace into the circumstances of his married life affords an insight into his wife's wrongs. In a conversation held between Mrs. Ashley, Elizabeth's governess, and her cofferer Parry, after the Queen's death, the possibility of a marriage between the widower and the princess was discussed, Parry raising objections to the scheme, on the score that he had heard evil of Seymour as being covetous and oppressive, and also how cruelly, dishonourably, and jealously he had used the Queen. Ashley, from first to last, eager to forward the Admiral's interests, brushed the protest aside. "Tush, tush," she replied, "that is no matter. I know him better than ye do, or those that do so report him. I know he will make but too much of her, and that she knows well enough." The same witness confessed at this later date that she feared the Admiral had loved the Princess too well, and the Queen had been jealous of both, an avowal corroborated by Elizabeth's admissions, when she too underwent examination concerning the relations which had existed between herself and her stepmother's husband. "Cat Ashley told me," she deposed, "after the Lord Admiral was married to the Queen, that if my lord might have had his own will, he would have had me afore the Queen. Then I asked her how she knew that. Then she said she knew it well enough, both from himself and from others." If the correspondence quoted in a previous page is genuine, Elizabeth, though she may have had reason to keep her knowledge to herself, can have been in no doubt as to the Admiral's sentiments at the time of her father's death. With a governess of Mrs. Ashley's type, a girl of 15, such as Elizabeth was shown to be by her subsequent career, and a man like Seymour, it would not have been difficult to prophesy trouble. That the Admiral was in love with his wife's charge may be doubted, in the same way that ambition, rather than any other sentiment, may be credited with his desire to obtain her hand a few months earlier. What was certain was that he amused himself, after his boisterous fashion, with the sharp-witted girl to an extent calculated to cause both uneasiness and anger to the Queen. That no actual harm was intended may be true. He could scarcely have been blind to the consequences had he dared to deal otherwise with the daughter and sister of kings. And the whole story, when it subsequently came to light, reads like an instance of coarse and vulgar flirtation, in harmony with the nature of the man and the habits of the times. What is less easy to account for is Catherine's partial connivance, in its earlier stages, at the rough horseplay, if nothing worse, carried on by her husband and her stepdaughter. A scene, for example, is described as taking place at Hanworth, where the Admiral, in the garden with his wife and the Princess, cut the girl's gown, being black cloth, into 100 pieces. Elizabeth replying to Mrs. Ashley's protests by saying that she could not strive withal, for the Queen held her while the Lord Admiral cut the dress. Nor was this the only occasion upon which Catherine appears to have looked on without disapproval, whilst her husband treated her charge in a fashion befitting her character neither as princess nor guest. The explanation may lie in the fact that the unfortunate Queen was attempting to adapt her taste and her manners to those of the man she had married. But the condition of the household could not last. A crisis was reached when one day Catherine, coming unexpectedly upon the two, found Seymour with the Princess in his arms, and decided, none too soon, that an end must be put to the situation. It was not long after that the households of Queen and Princess were parted, and, as I remember, explained Parry the cofferer, this was the cause why she was sent from the Queen, or else that her Grace parted from the Queen. I do not perfectly remember whether of both she, Ashley, said she went of herself or was sent away. There can be little doubt, one would imagine, that it was Catherine who determined to disembarrass herself of her visitor. A letter from Elizabeth, evidently written after their separation, appears to show that farewell had been taken in outwardly friendly fashion, although the promise she quotes Catherine as making has an ambiguous sound about it. The Princess wrote to say that she had been replete in sorrow at leaving the Queen, and albeit I answered little, I weighed it more deeply when you said you would warn me of all evils that you should hear of me. For if your Grace had not a good opinion of me, you would not have offered friendship to me that way, that all men judge the contrary. It is not difficult to detect the sore feeling underlying Elizabeth's acknowledgments of a promise of open criticism. Catherine must have breathed more freely when the Princess and her governess had quitted the house. Meantime, in spite of disappointment and anger and care, the winter was to bring the Queen one genuine cause of rejoicing. Thrice married without children, she was hoping to give Seymour an heir, and the prospect was hailed with delight by husband and wife alike. In her gladness, and the chief cause of dissension removed, her just grounds of complaint were forgotten. Her letters continued to be couched in terms as loving as if no domestic friction had interrupted her wedded happiness, and she ranged herself upon Seymour's side in his recurrent disputes with his brother, with a passionate vehemence out of keeping with her character. "This shall be to advertise you," she wrote sometime in 1548, "that my lord your brother hath this afternoon made me a little warm. It was fortunate we were so much distant, for I suppose else I should have bitten him. What cause have they to fear having such a wife? It is requisite for them continually to pray for a dispatch of that hell. Tomorrow, or else upon Saturday, I will see the king, where I intend to utter all my choler to my lord your brother, if you shall not give me advice to the contrary." Another letter, also indicating the strained relations existing between the brothers, is again full of affection for the man who deserved it so ill. "I gave your little knave your blessing," she tells the Admiral, alluding to the unborn child neither parent was to see grow up, "bidding my sweetheart and loving husband better to fare than myself." A few months more, and hope and fear and love and disappointment were alike to find an end. Sudeley Castle, where the final scene took place, was a property granted to the Admiral on the death of the late King, from which he took his title as Lord Seymour of Sudeley. It was a question whether those responsible for the government had the right of alienating possessions of the Crown during the minority of a sovereign, and the tenure upon which the place was held was therefore insecure, Catherine asserting on one occasion that it was her husband's intention to restore it to his nephew when he should come of age. In awaiting that event, Seymour and his wife had the enjoyment of the beauty for which the old building had long been noted. "Ah, Sudeley Castle, thou art the traitor, not I," said one of its former lords as, arrested by the orders of Henry IV for treason, and taken away to abide his trial, he cast a last look back at his home, a possession worthy of being coveted by a king, and by the attainder of its owner forfeited to the Crown. Here, during the summer of 1548, the last Catherine was to see, a motley company gathered round the Queen. Jane Grey, the young and early wise, was still a member of her household, and the repudiated wife of Catherine's brother, the Earl of Northampton, placed, it would seem, under some species of restraint, was in the keeping of her sister-in-law. Her true and tried friend, Lady Tyrwhitt, described by her husband as half a Scripture woman, kept her company, as she had done in her perilous days of royal state. Learned divines, living with her in the capacity of chaplains, were inmates of the castle, charged with the duty of performing service twice each day, exercises little to the taste of the master of the house, who made no secret of his aversion for them. "I have heard say," affirmed Latimer, in the course of one of the sermons preached after Seymour's execution, in which the bishop took occasion again and again to revile the dead man, "I have heard say that when the good Queen that is gone had ordained daily prayer in her house, both before noon and afternoon, the Admiral getteth him out of the way, like a mole digging in the earth. He shall be Lot's wife to me as long as I live." To Sudeley also had repaired, in the course of the summer, Lord Dorset, possibly desirous of assuring himself that all was well with his little daughter. He may have had other objects in view. According to his subsequent confession, Seymour had discussed with him the methods to be pursued in order to gain popularity in the country, making significant inquiries as to the formation of the Marquis's household. Learning that Dorset had divers gentlemen who were his servants, the Admiral admitted that it was well. "Yet," he added shrewdly, "trust not too much to the gentlemen, for they have something to lose." proceeding to urge his ally to make much of the chief yeomen and men of their class who were able to persuade the multitude, to visit them in their houses, bringing venison and wine, to use familiarity with them, and thus to gain their love. Such, he added, was his own intention. Another inmate had been received at Sudeley not more than a few weeks before Catherine's confinement. This was Princess Elizabeth, who appears, by a letter she addressed to the Queen when the visit had been concluded, to have been at this time again on terms of friendship and affection with her stepmother, since, writing to Catherine with very little leisure on the last day of July, she returned humble thanks for the Queen's wish that she should have remained with her till she were weary of that country. Yet, in spite of the hospitable desire, she can scarcely have been a welcome guest, and it must have been with little regret that her stepmother saw her depart. Meantime, the birth of the Queen's child was anxiously expected. Seymour characteristically desired a son, who, should God give him life to live as long as his father, will avenge his wrongs, the problematical wrongs of a man who had risen to his heights. Elizabeth, who had done her best to wreck the Queen's happiness and peace, was praying the Almighty God to send her a most lucky deliverance. And Mary, more sincere in her friendship, wrote a letter full of affection to her stepmother. The preparations made by Catherine for the newcomer equalled in magnificence those that might have befitted a Prince of Wales; and though the birth of a girl on August 30th must have been in some degree a disappointment, she received a welcome scarcely less warm than might have been accorded to the desired son. A general reconciliation appears to have taken place on the occasion, and the Protector responded to the announcement of the event in terms of cordial congratulation, regarding the advent of so pretty a daughter in the light of a prophecy and good hansel to a great sort of happy sons. 8 days after the rejoicings at the birth, Catherine was dead. Into the circumstances attending her illness and death close inquisition was made, at a time when it had become an object to throw discredit upon the Admiral, and foul play, the use of poison, was suggested. The charge was probably without foundation. The facts elicited nevertheless afford additional proof of the unsatisfactory relations existing between husband and wife, and throw a melancholy light upon the closing scene of the union from which so much had been hoped. It was deposed by Lady Tyrwhitt, one of the principal witnesses, that, upon her visiting the chamber of the sick woman one morning, 2 days before her death, Catherine had asked where she had been so long, adding that she did fear such things in herself that she was sure she could not live. When her friend attempted to soothe her by reassuring words, the Queen went on to say, holding her husband's hand and being, as Lady Tyrwhitt thought, partly delirious, "I am not well handled, for those that be about me care not for me, but stand laughing at my grief, and the more good I will to them, the less good they will to me." The words, to those cognizant of the condition of the household, must have been startling. The Queen may have been wandering, yet her complaint, as such complaints do, pointed to a truth. Others, besides Lady Tyrwhitt, were standing by, and Seymour made no attempt to ignore his wife's meaning, or to deny that the charge was directed against himself. "Why, sweetheart," he said, "I would do you no hurt." "No, my lord, I think not," answered Catherine aloud, adding, in his ear, "but, my lord, you have given me many shrewd taunts." These words, said Lady Tyrwhitt in her narrative, I perceived she spake with good memory, and very sharply and earnestly, for her mind was sore disquieted. After consultation, it was decided that Seymour should lie down by her side, and seek to quiet her by gentle words. But his efforts were ineffectual, the Queen interrupting him by saying, roundly and sharply, that she would have given 1,000 marks to have had her full talk with the doctor on the day of her delivery, but dared not for fear of his displeasure. "And I, hearing that," said the lady-in-waiting, "perceived her trouble to be so great that my heart would serve me to hear no more." Yet on that same day the dying queen made her will, and being persuaded, and perceiving the extremity of death to approach her, left all she possessed to her husband, wishing it 1,000 times more in value than it was. Whether pressure was used, or whether, in spite of all, her old love awakened and stirred her to kindness towards the man she was leaving, there is nothing to show. But the names of the witnesses, Robert Huyck, the physician attending her, and John Parkhurst, her chaplain, afterwards a bishop, would seem a guarantee that the document, dictated but not signed, no uncommon case, was genuine. For the rest, Seymour was coarse and heartless, a man of ambition, and intent upon the furtherance of his fortunes. It is not unlikely that, when his wife lay dying, his thoughts may have turned to the girl to whom he had in his own way already made love, who, of higher rank than the Queen, might serve his interests better, and whom her death would leave him free to win as his bride. And Catherine, with the memories of the last 2 years to aid her, and with the intuitions born of love and jealousy, may have divined his thoughts. But of murder, or of hastening the end by actual unkindness, there is no reason to suspect him. The affair was in any case sufficiently tragic, and one more mournful recollection to be stored in the minds of those who had loved the Queen. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Lady Jane Grey and Her Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Lady Jane Grey and Her Times by Ida Ashworth Taylor. Chapter 8, 1548. Lady Jane's temporary return to her father. He surrenders her again to the Admiral. The terms of the bargain. One of the secondary but immediate effects of the Queen's death was to send Lady Jane Grey back to her parents. It was indeed to Seymour, and not to his wife, that the care of the child had been entrusted. But in his first confusion of mind, after what he termed his great loss, the Admiral appears to have recognized the difficulty of providing a home for a girl in her 12th year in a house without a mistress, and to have offered to relinquish her to her natural guardians. Having acted in haste, he was not slow to perceive that he had committed a blunder, and quickly reawakened to the importance of retaining the possession and disposal of the child. On September 17th, not 10 days after Catherine's death, he was writing to Lord Dorset to cancel, so far as it was possible, his hasty suggestion that she should return to her father's house, and begging that she might be permitted to remain in his hands. In his former letter he explained he had been partly so amazed at the death of the Queen as to have small regard either to himself or his doings, partly had believed that he would be compelled, in consequence of it, to break up his household. Under these circumstances he had suggested sending Lady Jane to her father, as to him who would be most tender of her. Having had time to reconsider the question, he found that he would be in a position to maintain his establishment much on its old footing. Therefore, putting my whole affiance and trust in God, he had begun to arrange his household as before, retaining the services not only of the gentlewomen of the late Queen's privy chamber, but also her inferior attendants. And doubting lest your lordship should think any unkindness that I should by my said letter take occasion to rid me of your daughter so soon after the Queen's death, for the proof both of my hearty affection towards you and goodwill towards her, I mind now to keep her until I shall next speak to your lordship, unless I shall be advertised from your lordship of your express mind to the contrary. His mother will, he has no doubt, be as dear to Lady Jane as though she were her daughter, and for his part he will continue her half-father and more." It was clear that the Admiral would only yield the point upon compulsion. Dorset, however, was not disposed to accede to his wishes. Developing a sudden parental anxiety concerning the child he had been content to leave to the care of others for more than 18 months, he replied, firmly though courteously, negativing the Admiral's request. "Considering," he said, "the state of my daughter and her tender years, wherein she shall hardly rule herself as yet without a guide, lest she should, for lack of a bridle, take too much the head, and conceive such opinion of herself that all such good behaviour as she heretofore have learned by the Queen's and your most wholesome instruction, should either altogether be quenched in her, or at the least much diminished, I shall in most hearty wise require your lordship to commit her to the governance of her mother, by whom, for the fear and duty she owes her, she shall be most easily ruled and framed towards virtue, which I wish above all things to be most plentiful in her." Seymour no doubt would do his best, but being destitute of any one who should correct the child as a mistress and monish her as a mother, Dorset was sure that the Admiral would think, with him, that the eye and oversight of his wife was necessary. He reiterated his former promise to dispose of her only according to Seymour's advice, intending to use his consent in that matter no less than his own. "Only I seek in these her young years, wherein she now standeth either to make or mar, as the common saying is, the addressing of her mind to humility, soberness, and obedience." It was the letter of a model parent, anxious concerning the welfare, spiritual and mental, of a beloved child, and Dorset, as he sealed and dispatched it, will have felt that policy and conscience were for once in full accord. Lady Dorset likewise wrote, endorsing her husband's views. "Whereas of a friendly and brotherly good will you wish to have Jane, my daughter, continuing still in your house, I give you most hearty thanks for your gentle offer, trusting, nevertheless, that for the good opinion you have in your sister, by courtesy meaning herself, you will be content to charge her with her, who promiseth you not only to be ready at all times to account for the ordering of your dear niece, but also to use your counsel and advice on the bestowing of her, whensoever it shall happen. Wherefore, my good brother, my request shall be that I may have the oversight of her with your good will, and thereby I shall have good occasion to think that you do trust me in such wise as is convenient that a sister be trusted of so loving a brother." The singular humility of the language used by a king's granddaughter in demanding restitution of her child is proof of the position held by the Admiral in the eyes of those as well fitted to judge of it as Dorset and his wife, only 6 months before he was sent to the scaffold. It was none the less plain that they were determined to regain possession of their daughter, and though not abandoning the hope of moving her parents from their purpose, Seymour yielded provisionally to their will, and sent Lady Jane home. A letter from the small bone of contention, dated October 1st, thanking him for his great goodness, and stating that he had ever been to her a loving and kind father, proves that her removal had taken place by that time. The same courier probably conveyed a letter from her mother, making her acknowledgments for Seymour's kindness to the child, and his desire to retain her, and adding an ambiguous hope that at their next meeting both would be satisfied. The Admiral, at all events, intended to obtain satisfaction. Where his interest was concerned, he was an obstinate man. Notwithstanding his apparent acquiescence, he meant to retain the custody of Lord Dorset's daughter, and he did so. Even his household understood that the concession made in sending her home was but temporary, and in a conversation with another dependent, Harrington, the same who had served his master as go-between before, observed that he thought the maids were continuing with the Admiral in the hope of Lady Jane's return. A visit paid by Seymour to Dorset decided the question. In the end, it is the latter who speaks. After long debating and much sticking of our sides, we did agree that my daughter should return. The Admiral had come to his house, and had been so earnest in his persuasions that he could not resist him. The old bait had been once again held out. Lady Jane, if Seymour could compass it, was to marry the King. Her mother was wrought upon till her consent was gained to a second parting, and when this was the case, observed the Marquis, throwing, according to precedent, the responsibility upon his wife, it was impossible for him to refuse his own. He added a pledge that, except the King, he would spend life and blood for Seymour. Thus the alliance between the two was renewed and cemented. A further item in the transaction throws an additional and unpleasant light upon the means taken to ensure the Lord Marquis's surrender. The Admiral was a practical man, and knew with whom he had to deal. He had not confined himself to vague pledges, which Dorset knew as well as he did that he might never be in a position to fulfil. He had accompanied his promises by a gift of hard cash, whether, as it were, for an earnest penny of the favour that he would show unto him when the said Lord Marquis had sent his daughter to the said Lord Admiral, he sent the said Lord Marquis immediately £500, parcel of £2,000, which he promised to lend unto him, and would have asked no bond of him at all for it, but only to leave the Lord Marquis's daughter for a gage. 500 golden arguments, and more to follow, were found irresistible by the needy Dorset. The pressing necessity that Jane should be under her mother's eye disappeared. The bargain was struck, and the guardianship of the child bought and sold. The Admiral was triumphant. It was not only the point of vantage implied by the possession of the little ward which he had feared to forfeit, but that his loss might be the gain of his brother and rival. There would be much ado for my Lady Jane, he told his brother-in-law, Northampton, and my Lord Protector, and my Lady Somerset would do what they could to obtain her yet for my Lord of Hertford, their son. They should not, however, prevail therein, for my Lord Marquis had given her wholly to him, upon certain covenants between them two. And then I asked him, said Northampton, describing the conversation, what he would do if my Lord Protector, handling my Lord Marquis of Dorset gently, should obtain his good will, and so the matter to lie wholly in his own neck. He answered he would never consent thereto. Thus Lady Jane was, for the first time, made an instrument of obtaining that of which her father stood in need. On this occasion it was money. On the next, her life was to be staked upon a more desperate hazard. In future she appears and disappears, now in sight, now passing behind the scenes, against the dark background of intrigue and hatred and bloodshed belonging to her times. End of chapter 8.
Chapter 9 of Lady Jane Grey and Her Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shana Cohen. Lady Jane Grey and Her Times by Ida Ashworth Taylor. Chapter 9. 1548 to 1549. Seymour and the Princess Elizabeth. His courtship. He is sent to the Tower. Elizabeth's examinations and admissions. The execution of the Lord Admiral. The matter of Jane's guardianship satisfactorily settled, Seymour turned his attention to one concerning him yet more intimately. He was a free man, and he meant to make use of his freedom. As after the death of Henry, so now, when fate rendered the project once more possible, he determined to attempt to obtain the Princess Elizabeth as his wife. The history of the autumn, as regarding him, is of his continued efforts to increase his power and influence in the country and to win the hand of the king's sister. Again, the contemporary Spanish chronicler supplies a popular summary of the affair which, inaccurate as it is useful in showing how his scheme was regarded by the public. According to this dramatic account of his proceedings, the admiral went boldly before the council, observed that, as uncle to the king, it was fitting that he should marry honourably, and that, having formerly been husband to the queen, it would not be much more were he to be accorded Madam Elizabeth, whom he deserved better than any other man. Referred by the lords of the council to the Protector, he is represented as approaching the Duke with a modest request that he might be granted not only Elizabeth as his bride, but also the custody of the king. When his brother heard this, he said he would see about it. Calling the council together, he repeated to them the demand made by the admiral that his nephew should be placed in his hands, continuing, as the lords looked at each other, that the matter must be well considered, since, in his opinion, his brother could have no good intent in asking first for the princess and then for the custody of the king. "The devil is strong," said the Protector. "He might kill the king and Madam Mary, and then claim the crown." Whilst this was the version of the admiral's project current in the street, there is no doubt that his desire to obtain a royal princess for his wife was calculated to accentuate the distrust with which he was regarded by the Protector and his friends. He was well known to aspire to at least a share in the government. As Elizabeth's husband, his position would be so much strengthened that it might be difficult to deny it to him, or to maintain the right of Somerset to retain supreme power. His proceedings were therefore watched with jealous vigilance, his designs upon the king's sister becoming quickly matter of public gossip. It was not a day marked by an over-scrupulous observance of respect for the dead, and Catherine was hardly in her grave before the question of her successor was freely canvassed amongst those chiefly concerned in it. "When I asked her, Ashley, what news she had from London," Elizabeth admitted when under examination at a later date, "she answered merrily, 'They say that your grace shall have my Lord Admiral, and that he will shortly come to woo you.'" The woman, an intriguer by nature, and keen to advance Seymour's interests, would have further persuaded her mistress to write a letter of condolence to comfort him in his sorrow, because, as Elizabeth explained, he had been my friend in the Queen's lifetime, and would think great kindness therein. Then I said I would not, for he needs it not. The blunt sincerity prompting the girl's refusal did her credit. It must have been patent to all acquainted with the situation, and most of all to Elizabeth, that the new-made widower stood in no need of consolation. But, in spite of her refusal to open communications with him, and though a visit proposed by Seymour was discouraged for fear of suspicion, he can have felt little doubt that in a struggle with Protector and Council he would have the princess on his side. In Seymour's household, naturally concerned in his fortunes, the projected marriage was a subject of anxious debate, and it was recognized by its members that their master was playing a perilous game. In a conversation between two of his dependents, Nicholas Throckmorton and one Whiteman, both shook their heads over the risk he would run should he attempt to carry his plan into effect. Beginning with the conventional acknowledgment of the Admiral's great loss, they wisely decided that it might after all turn to his advantage in making him more humble in heart and stomach toward my Lord Protector's grace. It was also hoped that, Catherine being dead, The Duchess of Somerset might forget old grudges, and, unless by his own fault, be once again favourable toward her husband's brother. The two men nevertheless agreed that the world was beginning to speak evil of Seymour, and discussing the chances of his attempt to match with one of the princesses, they determined, as they loved him, to do their best to prevent it, Whiteman in especial engaging to do all he could to break the dance. If Seymour was going to his ruin, it was not to be for lack of warnings. Sleeping at the house of Catherine's friends, the Tyrwhitts, one night soon after her death, the question of a marriage with a sister of the king's was mooted, when, although Seymour's aspirations were not definitely mentioned, Sir Robert spoke in a fashion frankly discouraging to any scheme of the kind on the part of his guest. Conversing after supper with his hostess, Seymour called to her husband as he passed by, saying jestingly that he was talking with my lady his wife in divinity, or divining of the future, that he had told her he wished the crown of England might be in as good a surety as that of France, where it was well known who was heir. So would it be in England, were the princesses married. Tyrwhitt answered dryly, "Whosoever married one of them without the consent of king or council," he said, "he would not wish to be in his place." "Why so?" asked the Admiral. "If he, for instance, had married thus, would it not be surety for the king? Was he not made by the king? Had he not all he had by the king? Was he not most bound to serve him truly?" Tyrwhitt refused to be convinced, reiterating that the man who married either princess had better be stronger than the council, for if they catch hold of him, they will shut him up. Lord Russell, the Lord Privy Seal, spoke no less openly to the adventurer of the danger he was running. The two were riding together to Parliament House in the Protector's train, when Russell opened the subject by observing that certain rumours were abroad which he was very sorry to hear, and that if the Admiral were seeking to marry either of the king's sisters, the special one being left discreetly uncertain, "Ye seek the means to undo yourself, and all those who shall come of you." Seymour replied carelessly that he had no such thought, and the subject was dropped. A few days later, however, he himself reintroduced it, demanding what reason existed to prevent him, or another man, wedding one of the late king's daughters. Again Russell reiterated his warning. The marriage, he declared, would prove fatal to him who made it, proceeding to point out, knowing that the argument would have more weight with the man with whom he had to do than recommendations to caution and prudence, that from a pecuniary point of view the match would carry with it no great advantage, a statement vehemently controverted by the Admiral, who throughout neither felt nor feigned any indifference to the financial aspect of the affair. During the ensuing months he was busily engaged in the prosecution of his scheme. He may have had a genuine liking for the girl to whom his attentions had already proved compromising. He could scarcely doubt that he had won her affections. But by a clandestine marriage Elizabeth would, under the terms of her father's will, have forfeited her right to the succession, and she was therefore safeguarded from any attempt on her suitor's part to induce her to dispense with the consent of the lawful authorities. Forced to proceed with circumspection, he made use of any opportunity that offered for maintaining a hold upon her, aided and abetted by the partisanship of her servants. A fortnight before Christmas he proffered the loan of his London house as a lodging when she should pay her winter visit to the capital, adding to her cofferer, through whom the suggestion was made, that he would come and see her Grace, which declaration, reported to her by Parry, she seemed to take very gladly and to accept it joyfully. Observing, moreover, that when the conversation turned upon Seymour, and especially when he was commended, the princess showed such countenance that it should appear she was very glad to hear of him, the cofferer was emboldened to inquire whether, should the council approve, she would marry him. "When that time comes to pass," answered Elizabeth, in the language of the day, "I will do as God shall put in my mind." Notwithstanding her refusal to commit herself, it was not difficult for those about her to divine after what fashion she would, in that case, be moved to act. Yet she retained her independence of spirit, and when told that the Admiral advised her to appeal to the Protector, through his wife, for certain grants of land, as well as for a London residence, she turned upon those who had played the part of his mouthpiece, in a manner indicating no intention of becoming his passive tool. "I dare say he did not so," she replied hotly, refusing to credit the suggestion he was reported to have made that she, a Tudor, should sue to his brother's wife in order to obtain her rights, nor would so. Parry adhered to his statement. "Yes," he answered, "by my faith." "Well, I will not do so," returned his mistress, "and so tell him. I will not come there, nor begin to flatter now." If the Admiral possessed partisans in the members of Elizabeth's household, it was probably no less owing to hostility toward the Somersets than to liking for himself, a passage of arms having taken place between Mrs. Ashley and the Duchess, who had found fault with the governess on account of the Princess having gone on a barge on the Thames by night, and for other light parts, observing, in which she was undoubtedly right, that Ashley was not worthy to have the charge of the daughter of a king. Such home truths were not unfitted to quicken the culprit's zeal in the cause of the Admiral, and Ashley was always at hand to push his interests. It was, nevertheless, necessary that the Princess's dependents should act with caution, and discussing with Lord Seymour the question of a visit he desired to pay her, Parry declined to give any opinion on the subject, professing himself unacquainted with his mistress's pleasure. The Admiral answered with assured indifference. "It was no matter," he said, "for there has been a talk of late. They say now I shall marry my Lady Jane," adding, "I tell you this but merrily, I tell you this but merrily." The gossip may have been repeated in the certainty that it would reach Elizabeth's ears, and in the hopes of rousing her to jealousy. But had it suited his plans, there is no reason to doubt that Seymour would not have hesitated to gain permanent possession of the ward who had been left him as a gage. Elizabeth was, however, nearer to the throne, and was, beside her few additional years, better suited to please his taste than the quiet child who dwelt under his roof. As it proved, he was destined to further his ambitious projects neither by marriage with Jane nor her cousin. By the middle of January the Protector had struck his blow, a blow which was to end in fratricide. Charged with treason, in conspiring to change the form of government and to carry off the person of the King, Seymour was sent on January 16 to the Tower, in those days so often the anteroom to death. Though he had long been suspected of harbouring designs against his brother's administration, the specific grounds of his accusation were based upon the confessions of one Sherrington, Master of the Mint at Bristol, who under examination, and in terror for his personal safety, had declared truly or falsely that he had promised to coin money for the Admiral, and had heard him boast of the number of his friends, saying that he thought more gentlemen loved him than loved the Lord Protector. The same witness added that he had heard Seymour say that, for her qualities and virtues, Lady Jane Grey was a fit match for the King, and he would rather he should marry her than the daughter of the Protector. Many of great name and place in England must have been disquieted by the news of the arrest of the man who stood so near the King, and who, if any one, could have counted upon being safeguarded by position and rank from the consequences of his rashness. His assertion that he was more loved than his brother amongst his own class was true, and not a few nobles will have trembled lest they should be implicated in his fall. Loyalty to a disgraced friend was not amongst the customs of a day when the friendship might mean death, and most men were anxious on these occasions to dissociate themselves from a former comrade. Elizabeth was not one of those with least to fear, and it is the more honourable to her that she showed no inclination to follow the example of others, or to abandon the cause of her lover. She was in an embarrassing, if not a dangerous, situation. No one knew to what extent she had been compromised, morally or politically, and the distrust of the government was proved by the arrest of both Ashley and Parry, and by the searching examination to which the Princess, as well as her servants, was subjected. Sir Robert Tyrwhitt, placed in charge of the delinquent, with directions to obtain from her all the information he could, found it no easy task. "I do assure your Grace," he wrote to Somerset, "she hath a good wit, and nothing is to be got from her but by great policy." She would own to no practice with regard to Seymour, either on her part or that of her dependents. "And yet I do see in her face," said Sir Robert, "that she is guilty, and yet perceive she will abide more storms before she will accuse Mrs. Ashley." Whatever may be thought of Elizabeth's former conduct, she displayed at this crisis no less staunchness and fidelity in the support of those she loved than a capacity and ability rare in a girl of 15, practically standing alone, confronted with enemies, and without advisers to direct her course. Writing to the Protector on January 28, she thanked him for the gentleness and goodwill he had displayed, professed her readiness to declare the truth in the matter at issue, gave an account of her relations with the Admiral, asserting her innocence of any intention of marrying him without the sanction of the Council, and vindicated her servants from blame. "These be the things," she concluded, "which I declared to Master Tyrwhitt, and also whereof my conscience beareth witness, which I would not for all earthly things offend in anything, for I know I have a soul to be saved as well as other folks have, wherefore I will, above all things, have respect unto the same." One request she made, namely, that she might come to court. Rumours against her honour were afloat, accusing her with being with child by the Lord Admiral, and upon these grounds, that she might show herself as she was, as well as upon a desire to see the King, she based her demand. Tyrwhitt shook his head over the composition. The singular harmony existing between Elizabeth's story and the depositions extracted from her dependents in the Tower struck him as suspicious and as pointing to a preconcerted tale. "They all sing one song," he wrote, "and so, I think, they would not, unless they had set the note before." And he continued to watch his charge narrowly, and to report her demeanour at headquarters, assisted in his office by his wife, who had been sent to replace the untrustworthy Ashley as governess to the Princess. "She beginneth now a little to droop," he wrote, "by reason she heareth that my Lord Admiral's houses be dispersed. And my wife telleth me she cannot hear him discommended, but she is ready to make answer thereto." Put as brave a face as she might upon the matter, Elizabeth was in a position of singular loneliness and difficulty. Her lover was in prison on a capital charge, her friend and confidant removed from her, her reputation tarnished. Nor was she disposed to accept in a humble spirit the oversight of the duenna sent her by the Council. As the close friend of the stepmother, whose kindness the Princess had so ill requited, Lady Tyrwhitt, for her part, would not in any case have been prejudiced in favour of her charge, or inclined to take an indulgent view of her misdemeanours, and the reception accorded her when she arrived to assume her thankless post was not such as to promote good feeling. Mrs. Ashley, the girl told the newcomer, was her mistress, and she had not so conducted herself that the Council should give her another. Lady Tyrwhitt, no more inclined than she to conciliation, retorted that, seeing the Princess had allowed Mrs. Ashley to be her mistress, she need not be ashamed to have any other honest woman in that place. And so the intercourse of governess and pupil was inaugurated. That Lady Tyrwhitt's taunt was undeniably justified did not the more soften the Princess towards her, and it was duly reported to the authorities in London that she had taken the matter so heavily that she wept all the night and lowered all the next day. The love, it was added, she yet beareth Ashley is to be wondered at. Tact and discretion might in time have availed to reconcile the Princess to the change in her household, but the methods employed by the Tyrwhitts do not appear to have been judicious. Sir Robert, taking up his wife's quarrel, told her significantly that if she considered her honour, she would rather ask to have a mistress than to be left without one, and complaining to his superiors that she could not digest his advice in any way, added vindictively, "If I should say my fantasy, it were more meet she should have 2 than 1." So the days went by, no doubt uncomfortably enough for all concerned. Regarding Tyrwhitt and his wife in the capacity of jailers, charged with the duty of eliciting her confessions, it was not with them that Elizabeth would take counsel as to the best course open to her. The revelations attained by cross-examination from her imprisoned servants as to the relations upon which she had stood during the Queen's lifetime with Catherine's husband were sufficiently damaging to lend additional colour to the scandalous reports in circulation, and her spirited demand that her fair fame should be vindicated by a proclamation forbidding the propagation of slanders concerning the King's sister was fully in character with the woman she was to become. Though not without delay, her request was granted, and the circumstantial fable of a child born and destroyed may be supposed to have been effectually suppressed. Whilst this had been Elizabeth's condition during the spring, the man to whom her troubles were chiefly due had been undergoing alternations of hope and fear. It may have seemed impossible that his brother should proceed to extremities, but there were times when, in the silence and seclusion of the prison-house, his spirits grew despondent. On February 16, when his confinement had lasted a month and his fate was still undecided, his keeper, Christopher Eyre, reported that on the previous Friday the Lord Admiral had been very sad. "I had thought," he said, upon Eyre remarking on his depression, "before I came to this place, that my Lord's Grace, with all the rest of the Council, had been my friends, and that I had as many friends as any man within this realm. But now I think they have forgotten me," proceeding to declare that never was poor knave more true to his prince than he, nor had he meant evil to his brother, though he had thought he might have had custody of the king. There is something pathetic in the dejection of the Admiral, arrogant, proud, vain, and ambitious, thus deserted by all upon whose friendship he had imagined himself able to count. It is impossible to avoid the conviction that, in spite of a surface boldness, the nobles of his day were apt to turn craven where personal danger was in question. On the battlefield valour was common enough, and when once hope was over, men had learnt, a needful lesson, to meet death on the scaffold with dignity and courage. But so long as a chance of life remained, it was their constant habit to abase themselves in order to escape their doom. We do not hear of a single voice raised in Seymour's defence. The common people, when Somerset in his turn had fallen a victim to jealousy and hate, made no secret of their sorrow and their love. But the nobles who had been his brother's supporters were silent and cowed, or went to swell the number of his accusers. By March 20, hope and fear were alike at an end. A bill of attainder had been brought into the House of Lords, after an examination of the culprit before the Council, when his demand to be confronted with his accusers had been refused. The evidence against him was reiterated by certain of the peers. The bill was passed without a division, and, in spite of the opposition of the Commons, who supported his claim to be heard in his own defence, the Protector cut the matter short by a message from the King declaring it unnecessary that the demand should be conceded. His doom was sealed. Was he innocent or guilty? Dr. Lingard, after an examination of the facts, believes that he was unjustly condemned, that if he had sought a portion of the power vested in the Protector, and might have been dangerous to the authority of his brother, the charge for which he was condemned, a design to carry off the king and excite a civil war, is unproved. Innocent or guilty, he was to die. In the words of Latimer, who in sermons preached after the execution made himself the apologist of the council by abuse levelled at the dead man, he perished dangerously, irksomely, horribly. Whether he be saved or no, I leave it to God, but surely he was a wicked man, and the realm is well rid of him. Thus Thomas Seymour was done to death by a brother, and cursed by a churchman. Sherrington, who had supplied the principal part of the evidence against him, received a pardon and was reinstated in his office. Of regret upon the part of friends or kinsfolk there is singularly little token. As they had fallen from his side in life, so they held apart from him in death. If Elizabeth mourned him, she was already too well versed in the world's wisdom to avow her grief, and is reported to have observed, on his execution, that a man had died full of ability, esprit, but of scant judgment. Whether or not the Lord Protector was troubled by remorse, he was not likely to make the public his confidant, and Catherine, the woman who had loved him so devotedly, was dead. End of Chapter 9. Recording by Shana Cohen. Chapter 10 of Lady Jane Grey and Her Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shana Cohen. Lady Jane Grey and Her Times by Ida Ashworth Taylor. Chapter 10, 1549 to 1550. The Protector's Position. Disaffection in the country, its causes. The Duke's arrogance. Warwick, his rival. The success of his opponents. Placed in the Tower but released. St. George's Day at Court. The Protector's conduct with regard to his brother does much to alienate sympathy from him in his approaching fall, in a sense, the consequence and outcome of the fratricide. He had sealed his doom the day on which he signed the warrant for the execution of his brother. If the Admiral, having crossed his will, was not safe, who could believe himself to be so? Yet the fashion of the accomplishing of his downfall, the treachery and deception practiced toward him by men upon whom he might fairly have believed himself able to count, lends a pathos to the end it might otherwise have lacked. For the present, his power and position showed no signs of diminution. The Queen, his wife's rival, was dead. The Admiral, who had dared to measure his strength against his brother's, would trouble him no more, unless as an unquiet ghost, an unwelcome visitant confronting him in unexpected places. During his protectorate he had added property to property, field to field, and was the master of 200 manors. If the public finances were low, Somerset was rich, and during this year the building of the house destined to bear his name was carried on a scale of splendor proportionate to his pretensions. Having thrown away the chief prop of his house, says Heylin, he hoped to repair the ruin by erecting a magnificent palace. The site he had chosen was occupied by 3 episcopal mansions and 1 parish church, but it would have been a bold man who would have disputed the will of the all-powerful Lord Protector, and the owners submitted meekly to be dispossessed in order to make room for his new abode. Materials running short, there were rough and ready ways of providing them conveniently near at hand, and certain superstitious buildings close to St. Paul's, including 1 or 2 chapels and a fair charnel house, were demolished to supply what was necessary, the bones of the displaced dead being left to find burial in the adjacent fields, or where they might. As the great pile rose, more was required, and St. Margaret's, Westminster, was to have been destroyed to furnish it, had not the people, less subservient than the bishops, risen to protect their church and forcibly driven away the laborers charged with the work of destruction. St. Margaret's was saved, but St. John's of Jerusalem, not far from Smithfield, was sacrificed in its stead, being blown up with gunpowder in order that its stonework might be turned to account. The Protector pursued his way unconscious of danger. The Earl of Warwick, his future supplanter, looked on and bided his time. The condition of the country had become such as to facilitate the designs of those bent upon a change in the government. Into the course of public affairs, at home and abroad, it is impossible to enter at length. A brief summary will suffice to show that events were tending to create discontent and to strengthen the hands of Somerset's enemies. The victory of Pinkie Cleugh, though gratifying to national pride, had in no wise served the purpose of terminating the war with Scotland. Renewed with varying success, the Scots, by means of French aid, had upon the whole improved their position, and the hopes indulged in England of a union between the 2 countries, to be peacefully effected by the marriage of the king with the infant Mary Stuart, had been disappointed. the little queen having been sent to France and affianced to the Dauphin. In the distress prevailing amongst the working classes of England, more pressing cause for dissatisfaction and agitation was to be found. Partly the result of the depreciation of the currency during the late reign, it was also due to the action of the new owners, who, enriched by ecclesiastical property, had enclosed portions of church lands heretofore left open to be utilized by the laborers for their personal profit. Pasturage was increasing in favor compared with tillage, less labor was required, and wages had in consequence fallen. To material ills and privations, other grievances were added. Associated in the minds of the people with their condition of want were the changes lately enforced in the sphere of religion. The new ministers were often ignorant men, who gave scandal by their manner of life, their parishioners frequently making complaints of them to the bishops. "Our curate is naught," they would say, "an asshead, a dodipot, a lack-Latin, and can do nothing. Shall I pay him tithe that doth us no good, nor none will do?" In some cases the fault lay with patrons, who preferred to select a man unlikely to assert his authority. Economy on the part of the government was responsible for other unfit appointments, and capable churchmen being permitted to hold secular offices, they were removed from their parishes, and their flocks were left unshepherded. Against this practice Latimer protested in a sermon at St. Paul's, on the occasion of a clergyman having been made comptroller of the mint. "Who controlled the devil at home in his parish?" asked the rough-tongued preacher, whilst he controlled the mint. The condition of things thus produced was not calculated to commend the innovations it accompanied to the people, and the introduction of the new prayer book was in particular bitterly resented in country districts. In many parts of England, interest and religion joining hands, fierce insurrections broke out, and the measures taken by the good Duke to allay popular irritation, by ordering that the lands newly enclosed should be reopened, had the double effect of stirring the people, thus far successful, to yet more strenuous action in vindication of their rights, and of increasing the dislike and distrust with which his irresponsible exercise of authority was regarded by the upper classes. Upon domestic troubles, Kett's rebellion in Norfolk, one of the large dimensions in the West, and others, followed a declaration of war with France, certain successes on the part of the enemy serving to discredit the Protector and his management of affairs still further. Whilst rich and poor were alike disaffected in the country at large, the Duke had become an object of jealousy to the members of the Council Board, who were responsible for having placed him in the position he occupied. To a man with the sagacity to look ahead and take account of the forces at work, it must have been plain that the possession of absolute and undivided power on the part of a subject was necessarily fraught with danger, and that the Duke's astonishing success in obtaining the patent conferring upon him supreme and regal authority contained in itself the seed and prophecy of ruin. But, besides more serious causes of offence, his bearing in the council chamber, far from being adapted to conciliate opposition, further exasperated his colleagues against him. Cranmer and Paget were the last to abandon his cause, but on May 8, not 2 months after his brother's execution, the latter wrote to give him frank warning of the probable consequences of his great choleric fashions. It is evident that a stormy scene had taken place that afternoon, and that Paget must have been strongly convinced of the need for interference before he addressed his remonstrance to the despotic head of the government. "Poor Sir Richard Ali," he wrote, "this afternoon, after your Grace had very sore, and much more than needed, rebuked him, came to my chamber weeping, and there complaining, as far as became him, of your handling of him, seemed almost out of wits and out of heart. Your Grace had put him clean out of countenance." After which he proceeded to warn the Duke solemnly, for the very love he bore him, of the consequences should he not change his manner of conduct. Paget's love was quickly to grow cold. During the summer the various rebellions in different parts of the country were suppressed, the Earl of Warwick playing an important part in the operations. On September 25 the Protector was, to all appearance, still in fullness of power and authority. By October 13 he was in the Tower. The Spanish Spectator again supplies an account of the view taken by the man in the street of the initiation of the quarrel which led to the Duke's disgrace and fall. Returned to London, Warwick, accompanied by the captains, English and foreign, who had served under him against the rebels, is said to have come to court to demand for his soldiers the rewards he considered their due. Met by a refusal on the part of the Protector of anything over and above their ordinary wages, his indignation found vent. If money was not to be had, it was because of the sums squandered by the Duke in building his own palace. The French forts were already lost. If the Protector continued in power, he would end by losing everything. Somerset replied with no less heat. He deserved, he said, that Warwick should speak as he had spoken, by the favour he had shown him. Warwick having retorted that it was with himself and his colleagues that the fault lay, since they had bestowed so much power on the Protector, the two parted. Of what followed, Holinshed gives a description. Suddenly, upon what occasion many marvelled, but few knew, every lord and counsellor went through the city weaponed, and had their servants likewise weaponed, to the great wondering of many. And at the last a great assembly of the said council was made at the Earl of Warwick's lodging, which was then at Ely Place in Holborn, whither all the confederates came privily armed, and finally concluded to possess the Tower of London. As a counterblast, Somerset issued a proclamation in the king's name, summoning all his subjects to Hampton Court for his defence, and that of his most entirely beloved uncle. Open war was declared. So far, the Archbishop and Paget, both resident with the court, together with the two secretaries, had adhered to the Protector. Upon Cranmer, if upon anyone, Somerset, who had done more than any other person to establish religion upon its new basis, should have been able to count, if not for support, for a loyal opposition. But fear is strong, and, again, it must be repeated, fidelity to the unfortunate was no feature of the times, and by both Archbishop and Paget the cause of the falling man was abandoned. Not only did they secretly embrace the cause of the party headed by Warwick, but private directions were furnished by Paget as to the means to be employed in seizing the person of the Duke. Meantime, Hampton Court being judged insufficiently secure, Somerset, with a guard of 500 men, had removed the king at dead of night to Windsor, a graphic account of the journey being given by the chronicler. As he went along the road, the king was all armed, and carried his little sword drawn, and kept saying to the people on the way, "My vassals, will you help me against the people who want to kill me?" And everybody cried out, "Sir, we will all die for you." Windsor reached, the defence of the castle and of the sovereign was wisely entrusted, in the first instance, to men upon whom the Duke could depend. But the council was successful in lulling any apprehensions of violent action to rest. Sir Philip Hoby, according to some authorities, was despatched from London with open as well as secret letters, wherein it was declared that no harm was intended to the Duke. Order was merely to be taken for the protectorship. Somerset had by this time yielded so far to the forces arrayed against him as to recognize the necessity of consenting to some change in the government, and at the reassuring terms of the communication all present gave way to emotion, wept with joy, after the fashion of the times, thanked God, and prayed for the lords, Paget in particular clasping the Duke about the knees, and crying with tears, "O my lord, ye see what my lords be!" The Protector's ruin had been assured. Trusting to the declarations of the council, he fell an easy prey into their hands. Yielding to the representations of Cranmer and Paget, to whose diligent travail his enemies gratefully ascribed their success, he permitted his trusty followers to be replaced in the defence of the castle by the usual royal guard. On October 11 he had been seized and placed in safe-keeping, and it was reported that the king had a bad cold, and much desireth to be hence, saying that, "Methinks I am in prison. Here be no galleries, nor no gardens to walk in." The young sovereign had also, with a merry countenance and a loud voice, asked how their lordships of the council were, and when he would see them,
saying that they should be welcome whensoever they came. It was plain that objections to a transference of his guardianship were not to be expected from the nephew of the Lord Protector, and the Duke was removed from Windsor to the Tower, followed by 300 lords and gentlemen, as if he had been a captive carried in triumph. It would, however, have been more difficult to induce the boy to consent to the execution of another of his closest kin, and there may have been some fraction of truth in the report which gained currency, that the king had not been made acquainted with the fact that his uncle was actually a prisoner until he learnt it from the Duchess. He then sent for the Archbishop and questioned him on the subject. "Godfather," he is made to say, "what has become of my uncle, the Duke?" The explanation furnished him by Cranmer, to the effect that, had God not helped the lords, the country would have been ruined, and it was feared that the Protector might have slain the king himself, did not appear to commend itself to the young sovereign. The Duke, he said, had never done him any harm, and he did not wish him to be killed. A king's wishes, even at 13, have weight, and Warwick suddenly discovered that good should be returned for evil, and that since it was the king's desire, the first thing he had asked of his council, the Duke must be pardoned. What is more certain is that, on condition of an unqualified acknowledgment of his guilt, accompanied by forfeiture of offices and property, it was decided that Somerset should be set at liberty. Self-respect or dignity was not in fashion, and in the eyes of some the submission of the late Lord Protector assumed the character of an abjectness. For the moment it purchased for him safety, and he was gradually permitted to regain a certain amount of influence and power. Some portion of his wealth was restored to him, and he was at length readmitted to the council and to a limited share in the government. To sanguine eyes, all seemed to have been placed on a satisfactory footing. But jealousy, distrust, and hatred take much killing. The position of the man who was the king's nearest of kin amongst his nobles, and had lately been all-powerful in the state, was a difficult one. Warwick was rising and meant to rise. Somerset was not content to remain fallen and discredited. What seemed a peace was merely an armistice. Meantime, Warwick and his friends were no more successful than his rival in maintaining the national honour, and the peace with France, concluded during the spring, was regarded by the nation as a disgrace. Boulogne was surrendered to its natural owners, and in magniloquent terms war was once more stated to be at an end for ever between the two countries. Court and courtiers troubled themselves little with such matters, and on St. George's Day a brilliant company of Lords of the Council and Knights of the Garter kept the festival at Greenwich, when a glimpse of the 13-year-old king is to be caught in a more boyish mood than usual. Coming out from the discourse preached in honour of the day, in high spirits and in the argumentative humour fostered by sermons, the godly and virtuous imp turned to his train. "My lords," he demanded, "I pray you, what saint is St. George, that we here so honour him?" The sudden attack was unexpected, and the lords of the council being astonied by it, it was the treasurer who made reply. "If it please your majesty," he said, "I did never read in any history of St. George, but only in Legenda Aurea, where it is thus set down, that St. George out with his sword, and ran the dragon through with his spear." The king, when he could not a great while speak for laughing, at length said, "I pray you, my lord, and what did he do with his sword the while?" "That I cannot tell, your majesty," he said. Poor little king, poor godly imp! It is seldom that his laughter rings out through the centuries. Perhaps some of the grave councillors or divines present may have looked askance, considering that it was not with the weapon of ridicule that the patron saint of England should be most fitly attacked, but with the more legitimate one of theological criticism. But to us it is satisfactory to find that there were times when even the modern Josiah could not speak for laughing.
End of chapter 10.
Chapter 11 of Lady Jane Grey and Her Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lady Jane Grey and Her Times by Ida Ashworth Taylor. Chapter 11, 1549 to 1551. Lady Jane Grey at Home. Visit from Roger Ascham. The German Divines. Position of Lady Jane in the theological world. Whilst these events had been taking place, Jane Grey had been once more relegated to the care of her parents, to whose house she had been removed upon the imprisonment of her guardian, the Admiral, in January 1549. To the helpless and passive plaything of worldly and political exigencies, the change from Seymour Place in Hanworth, where she had lived under Seymour's roof, to the quiet of her father's Leicestershire home must have been great, nor was the difference in the moral atmosphere less marked. Handsome, unprincipled, gay, magnificent, one imagines that the Admiral, in spite of the faults to which she was probably not blind, must have been an imposing personage in the eyes of his little charge, and self-interest, the interest of a man who did not guess that the future held nothing for him but a grave, as well as a natural kindliness towards a child dependent upon him, will have led him to play the part of her half-father in a manner to win her affection. Was she not destined, should his schemes prosper, to fill the place of queen consort? Or, failing that, might it not be well to turn into earnest the merry possibility he had mentioned to Parry, and, if Elizabeth was denied him, to make her cousin his wife? In any case, so long as she lived in his house, Jane was a guest of importance, of royal blood, to be treated with consideration, cared for, and flattered. But now the ill-assorted housemates had parted. Seymour had taken his way to the Tower, as a stage towards the scaffold, and Jane had returned, gladly or sorrowfully, who can tell, to the shelter of the parental roof, and to the care of a father and mother determined upon neutralizing, by their conduct, any ill effects produced by her 2 years of emancipation from their control. Once more, she was an insignificant member of her father's family, the eldest of his 3 children, subjected to the strictest discipline and, whatever the future might bring forth, of little consequence in the present. It is possible that Lord Dorset's fears, expressed at the time when he was attempting to regain possession of his daughter, had been in part realized, and that Jane, for lack of a bridle, had taken too much the head, and conceived an unduly high opinion of herself. It would, indeed, have been a natural outcome of the position she held, both in her guardian's house and, as will be seen, in the estimation of divines. If this was the case, her mother and he were to do their best to address her mind to humility, soberness, and obedience. The means taken to carry out their intentions were harsh. Of the year following upon Jane's return to Bradgate little is known, but in the summer of 1550 a picturesque and vivid sketch is offered by Roger Ascham of the child of 13 upon whom so many hopes centred and so many expectations were built. In the description given in his Schoolmaster of the visit paid by the great scholar to Bradgate, light is thrown alike upon the system of training pursued by Lord Dorset, upon the character of his daughter, and upon the spirit she displayed in conforming to the manner of life enforced upon her. Ascham, in his capacity of tutor to her cousin Elizabeth, had known Jane intimately at court. So he states in a letter to Sturm, another of the academic brotherhood, and had already received learned letters from her. Before starting on a diplomatic mission to Germany in the summer of 1550, he had visited some friends in Yorkshire, and on his way south turned aside to renew his acquaintance with Lady Jane, and to pay his respects to her father, who stood high in the estimation of the religious party to which Ascham belonged. To this visit we owe one of the most distinct glimpses of the girl that we possess. By a fortunate chance he found that most noble Lady Jane Grey, to whom I was exceeding much beholden, alone. Lord and Lady Dorset, with all their household, were hunting in the park, and Jane, in the seclusion of her chamber, was engaged in studying the Phaedo of Plato, with as much delight as some gentlemen would read a merry tale in Boccaccio, when Ascham presented himself to her. The conversation between the scholar and the student places Lady Jane's small, staid figure in clear relief. Notwithstanding Plato's Phaedo, notwithstanding, too, the sun outside, the sounds of horns, the baying of hounds, and all the other allurements she had proved able to resist, there is something very human and unsaintly in her fashion of unburthening herself to a congenial spirit concerning the wrongs sustained at the parental hands. To Ascham, with whom she had been so well acquainted under different circumstances, she opened her mind freely when, after salutation and duty done, he inquired how it befell that she had left the pastimes going forward in the park. "I wis," she answered, smiling, the smile surely of a conscious and complacent superiority, "all their sport in the park is but a shadow to the pleasure that I find in Plato. Alas, good folk, they never felt what true pleasure meant." "And how came you, madame," asked Ascham, "to this deep knowledge of pleasure, and what did chiefly allure you to it, seeing not many women, but very few men, have attained thereto?" Jane, nothing loath to satisfy her guest's curiosity, did so at length. "I will tell you," she answered, "and tell you a truth which perchance you will marvel at. One of the greatest benefits that ever God gave me is that he sent me so sharp and severe parents and so gentle a schoolmaster. For when I am in presence either of father or mother, whether I speak, keep silence, sit, stand, or go, eat, drink, be merry or sad, be sewing, playing, dancing, or doing anything else, I must do it, as it were, in such weight, measure, and number, even so perfectly as God made the world, or else I am so sharply taunted, so cruelly threatened, yea, presently sometimes with pinches, nips, and bobs, and other ways which I will not name for the honor I bear them, so without measure disordered, that I think myself in hell, till time come that I must go to Mr. Elmer, who teacheth me so gently, so pleasantly, with such fair allurements to learning, that I think all the time nothing whiles I am with him, and when I am called away from him I fall on weeping, because whatever I do else but learning is full of grief, trouble, fear, and whole misliking unto me. And thus my book hath been so much my pleasure, and bringeth daily to me more pleasure and more, that in respect of it all other pleasures in very deed be but trifles and troubles to me." Jane's recitals of her wrongs, if correctly reported, and Ascham says he remembers the conversation gladly, both because it was so worthy of memory, and because it was the last time he ever saw that noble and worthy lady, proves that her command of the vernacular was equal to her proficiency in the dead languages, and that she cherished a very natural resentment for the treatment to which she was subjected. There is something irresistibly provocative of laughter in the thought of the two scholars, old and young, and of the lofty compassion displayed by the chidden child towards the frivolous tastes and amusements of the parents, to whom she doubtless outwardly accorded the exaggerated respect and reverence demanded by custom. Few would grudge the satisfaction derived from a sympathetic listener to the girl whose pleasures were to be so few, and days for enjoying them so short. When Ascham took leave, he had received a promise from Jane to write to him in Greek, provided that he would challenge her by a letter from Germany, and so they parted to meet no more. It may be that Lady Jane's sense of the harshness and severity of her treatment at home was accentuated by the tone adopted with regard to her by many of the leading Protestant divines. To these men to whom Mary was Jezebel, Gardner that lying and subtle Cerberus, and by whom persons holding theological views at variance with their own were freely and unreservedly handed over to the devil, Jane was not only wise, learned, and saintly beyond her years, but to her they turned their eyes, hoping for a future when, at the king's side, she might prove the efficient protectress and patroness of the Reformed Church. Her name was a household word amongst them. and whilst it can have been scarcely possible that she was indifferent to the incense offered by those to whom she had been instructed to look up, it may have rendered the system of repression adopted by her parents more unendurable than might otherwise have been the case. Bradgate was a centre of strong and militant Protestantism. In conjunction with Warwick, the Marquis of Dorset was regarded by the German school of theologians as one of the two most shining lights of the Church, and the many letters sent from England to Henry Bullinger at Zurich, some of them dated from Bradgate itself, abound in allusions to the family, and throw a useful light upon this part of Lady Jane's life. In these epistles her father's name recurs again and again, always in terms of extravagant eulogy, and as that of a munificent patron of needy divines. Thus he had bestowed a pension at first sight upon Ulmis, a young disciple of Bullinger's, doubling it some months later, and his grateful protégé, striving to make what return is possible, impresses upon the foreign master the advisability of dedicating one of his works to the generous Marquis, anxiously sending him, when his request has been granted, the full title to be used in so doing. He told me, indeed, he adds, that he had the title of Prince, but that he would not wish to be so styled by you, so you must judge for yourself whether to keep it back or not. Bullinger is likewise urged to present a copy of one of his books to the Marquis's daughter, and, take my word for it, you will never repent having done so. A most learned and courteous letter would thereby be elicited from her. She had already translated into Greek a good part of Bullinger's treatise on marriage, put by Ulmis himself into Latin, and had given it to her father as a New Year's gift. In May, 1551, another letter records that 2 days had been very agreeably passed at Bradgate with Jane, my lord's daughter, and those excellent and holy persons Aylmer, her tutor, and Haddon, chaplain to the Marquis. For my own part, I do not think there ever lived anyone more deserving of respect than this young lady, if you regard her family, more learned, if you consider her age, or more happy, if you consider both. A report has prevailed, and has begun to be talked of by persons of consequence, that this most noble virgin is to be betrothed and given in marriage to the King's Majesty. Oh, if that event should take place, how happy would be the union, and how beneficial to the Church! A letter dispatched by Ulmis on the same day to another of his brethren in the faith, Conrad Pelican, craves his advice on behalf of Lady Jane with regard to the best means of acquiring Hebrew, a language she was anxious to study. She had written to consult Bullinger on the subject, but Bullinger was a busy man, and all the world knew how perfect was Pelican's acquaintance with the subject. Pelican may argue that he might seem lacking in modesty should he address a young lady, the daughter of a nobleman, unknown to him personally. But he is besought by Ulmis to entertain no fears of the kind, and his correspondent will bear all the blame if he ever repents of the deed, or if Lady Jane does not most willingly acknowledge his courtesy. In truth, he adds, I do not think that amongst the English nobility for many ages past there has arisen a single individual who, to the highest excellences of talent and judgment, has united so much diligence and assiduity in the cultivation of every liberal pursuit. It is incredible how far she has advanced already, and to what perfection she will advance in a few years, for I well know that she will complete what she has begun, unless perhaps she be diverted from her pursuits by some calamity of the times. If you write a letter to her, take care, I pray you, that it be first delivered to me. This letter is dated from the house of the daughter of the Marquis. Her mother, it is true, seems to have been at home, though Dorset was in Scotland, but it is a curious fact that the granddaughter of Henry VII, through whom James' royal blood was transmitted to her, appears to have been, by common consent, tacitly passed over as a person of no consequence in comparison with her daughter. Quite a budget of letters were entrusted to the courier who left Bradgate on May 29th, and was the bearer of the missives addressed by Ulmis to his master and friend. Both John Aylmer, tutor to Lord Dorset's children, and afterwards Bishop of London, and Haddon, the Marquis's chaplain, had taken the opportunity of writing to Bullinger, doubtless stimulated to the effort by his young disciple. The preceptor who compared so favorably in Lady Jane's eyes with her parents was a young Norfolk man of about 29 and singularly well learned in the Latin and Greek tongues. On James Haddon, Bishop Hooper, writing from prison when 3 years later the friends of the Reformation had fallen on evil days, pronounced a eulogy in a letter to Bullinger. Master James Haddon, he said, was not only a friend and very dear brother in Christ, but one he had always esteemed on account of his singular erudition and virtue. I do not think, he added, that I have ever been acquainted with anyone in England who is endued either with more sincere piety towards God or more removed from all desire of those perishing objects desired by foolish mortals. From Bishop Hooper the panegyric is evidence that Haddon belonged to the extreme party in theological matters, in which Aylmer was probably in full accord with him. On this particular day in May, both these devoted and conscientious men were sending letters to the great director of souls in Zurich, that of Haddon being written to a man to whom he was personally unknown, and with the sole object of opening a correspondence and offering a tribute of respect. Aylmer's case was a different one. Though also a stranger, he wrote at some length, chiefly in the character of the preceptor entrusted with Lady Jane's education, making due acknowledgments for the letters and advice which had been of so much use in keeping his patron and his patron's family in the right path, and begging Bullinger to continue these good offices towards the pupil, just 14, concerning whom it is strange to find the young man entertaining certain fears and misgivings. At that age, he observes, as the comic poet tells us, all people are inclined to follow their own ways, and, by the attractiveness of the objects and the corruptions of nature, are more easily carried headlong in pleasure than induced to follow those studies that are attended with the praise of virtue. The time teemed with many disorders. Discreet physicians must therefore be sought, and to tender minds there should not be wanting the counsel of the aged, nor the authority of grave and influential men. Aylmer accordingly entreats that Bullinger will minister, by letter and advice, to the improvement of his charge. An epistle from Jane, dated July 1551, shows that the German theologian responded at once to the appeal, since in it she acknowledges the receipt of a most eloquent and weighty letter, and mentioning the loss she had sustained in the death of Bucer, who appears to have taken his part in her theological training, congratulates herself upon the possession of a friend so learned as Bullinger, so pious a divine, and so intrepid a champion of true religion. Bereaved of the pious Bucer, who unweariedly did not cease, day and night, and to the utmost of his ability, to supply me with all necessary instructions and directions for my conduct in life, and who, by his excellent advice, promoted and encouraged my progress and advancement in all virtue, godliness, and learning, she proceeds to beg Bullinger to fill the vacant space, and to spur her on if she should loiter and be disposed to delay. By this means, she will enjoy the same advantages granted to those women to whom St. Jerome imparted instruction, or to the elect lady to whom the epistle of St. John was addressed, or to the mother of Severus, taught by Origen. As Bullinger could be deemed inferior to none of these teachers, she entreats him to manifest a like kindness. It is plain that Lady Jane, in addressing this brightest ornament in support of the whole Church, is determined not to be outdone in the art of pious flattery, and in her correspondence with men who both as scholars and divines held a foremost place in the estimation of those by whom she was surrounded, she indemnified herself for the mortifications inflicted upon her at home. The Reformers, for their part, were keeping an anxious watch upon the course of events in England, and to strengthen and maintain their influence over one who might have a prominent part to play in future years was of first importance. A letter from Ascham, who was still abroad, dated some months later, supplies yet another example of the incense offered to the child of 14, and of fulsome adulation by which an older head might have been turned. Nothing, he told her, in his travels, had raised in him greater admiration than had been caused when, on his visit to Bradgate, he had found one so young and lovely, so divine a maid, engaged in the study of Plato, whilst her friends and relations were enjoying field sports. Let her proceed thus, to the honour of her country, the delight of her parents, her own glory, the praise of her preceptor, the comfort of her relations and acquaintances, and the admiration of all. O happy Aylmer, to have a like scholar! It would be easy to multiply quotations, which indicate the place accorded to Lord Dorset's daughter in the estimation of the leaders of the extreme party of Protestantism, in whose eyes Cranmer was regarded as a possible trimmer. Allowing to him right views, Hooper, in writing to Bullinger, adds, "We desire nothing more for him than a firm and manly spirit." Contrary to general expectation, Traheron writes, the Archbishop had most openly, firmly, and learnedly maintained the opinion of the German divine upon the Eucharist, and Ulmis, alluding to him in terms of praise, repeats that he had unexpectedly given a correct judgment on the point. Even the youngest of the German theologians felt himself competent to weigh in the balances the head of Protestant England. Protestant England was itself keeping a wary eye upon its primate. The Archbishop of Canterbury, wrote Hooper to Bullinger, to tell the truth, neither took much note of your letter nor of your learned present. But now, as I hope, Master Bullinger and Canterbury entertain the same opinion. The people, that many-headed monster, he wrote again, is still wincing, partly through ignorance and partly persuaded by the inveiglements of the bishops and the malice and impiety of the mass priests. End of chapter 11.